The rose had been neglected for 6 years, and Miss Prudence Halliway intended to say so to its face. She knelt in the flower bed in her second-best brown dress, sleeves shoved past her elbows, and addressed the bush the way a magistrate addresses a man who has been robbing the parish for a decade and has only now been caught at it. She informed it that it had been abandoned. She informed it that the abandonment was over. She informed it that she expected roses by June, a great many of them, and that she would not be entertaining excuses about the soil, which she had already inspected and which was, frankly, better than the bush deserved. The bush said nothing, having no opinion, being a bush. But Prudence had learned, in 25 years of living in houses that belonged to other people, that a thing tended in silence stayed a stranger, and a thing spoken to, however sternly, began to be yours. She had never in her life owned a rosebush. She had 6 months to change that. She intended to use them. She was working a dead cane loose when something cold and wet pushed into the crook of her arm. She did not startle. Startling, in her experience, only encouraged things. She looked down at a very large gray dog, rough-coated, with the tragic eyes of a creature who has decided the whole world has been unfair to him and is prepared to forgive it only in exchange for affection. He shoved his nose deeper into her armpit and made a sound of profound contentment. "Good morning," said Prudence. "You are very handsome and very badly behaved. Who do you belong to?" "He belongs to me," said a voice from the edge of the garden. "He does not usually approach strangers." Prudence looked up. The voice belonged to a man of perhaps 29, tall, dark-haired, with a straight back and gray-green eyes that had the tired look of a person who slept the required number of hours and woke unrested anyway. He was standing at the edge of the garden, with the rigid posture of someone who has been watching a woman scold a plant for some time and would like it very much believed that he has only just that moment arrived. She was not fooled. Nobody stood that still on purpose. "He does not seem to consider me a stranger," she said, scratching the dog behind both ears. "I suspect he is a better judge of character than either of us." She returned to the rose. She was aware, in the way one is aware of weather, that the man had not left. He remained at the garden's edge while his loyal, mistrustful, people-avoiding dog rolled onto his back in the grass beside her and put all 4 legs in the air, exposing a belly the size of a card table and making a noise the Duke could only have described, had anyone asked him, as humiliating. "You are Miss Halliway," he said. "I am. And you are the Duke who has not called." "I did not wish to intrude." "You are standing in a garden, watching me weed. That is intruding. Calling would have been polite." He had, she noted with private satisfaction, no answer for this. His jaw did something complicated. A man less rigid might have smiled. This one appeared to consider smiling, examine it as one might examine a suspicious tradesman, and decline. "Forgive me," he said. "I will call properly." "You are here now," said Prudence. "There is a bench. It has a splinter on the left side. Sit on the right." He sat on the right side of the bench. She had not expected him to. She had expected a bow, a stiff sentence, a retreat to the great gray house that sat at the top of the rise looking down at the world, like a duchess who suspects the soup is cold. Instead, the Duke of Wenfield sat on the right side of her splintered bench, with his dog upside down at her knee, and said nothing, and did not leave. They stayed like that for the better part of an hour. A blackbird landed on the wall and passed judgment on them both. The April sun was thin and pale and could not be relied upon. The garden smelled of wet earth and green things beginning, and it was, Prudence thought, the least tiresome silence she had shared with another person in a very long time. Which was odd, because she had shared it with a man she had known for 40 minutes and who had, in that time, said fewer than 30 words. "Your steward tells me you do not entertain," she said, not looking up. "I do not." "He tells me you do not accept dinner invitations." "I do not." He tells me you are, and I quote, a good master, but a lonely man. He said it with the precise expression of a man who has been longing to say it for years and has finally been offered cake. A silence. Then, with the gravity of a man conceding a point in the Lords, my steward is unusually forthcoming. He is a man who has watched you eat dinner alone for 6 years and has developed opinions. I merely supplied the cake. The opinions were already there. The corner of the Duke's mouth moved. She saw it. He saw her see it, and killed it, and looked away toward the beech trees, as though they required supervision. When at last he stood, she pulled a dead cane free, with a crack that satisfied her enormously, and said, "Same time tomorrow if you like. I mean to do the second bed. It is in worse condition. I may have to say harsher things to it." He looked at her for 1 second. 2. "I would not want to miss that," said the Duke of Wenfield, and walked back up the hill with his dog trailing behind him, looking back twice. Ambrose did not look back. He went into the house. He closed the door. He stood in the great cold hall of Wenfield Park, which had 40 rooms and 1 occupant, and he said, aloud, to no one, "No." He went to the garden the next morning. He did not decide to. That was the trouble with it, he would think later, much later, when he had the leisure to be honest. He had never once decided to. He simply found himself, each morning, pulling on his boots at 10 minutes to 9, while Hector danced at the door in a manner beneath the dignity of both of them, and walking down the hill to a bench with a splinter on its left side. She was always already there. Some mornings weeding, some mornings reading with her feet tucked under her, some mornings sitting with her face turned up to the thin sun and her eyes shut, wearing the expression of a woman who is, for the first time in her life, precisely where she means to be. She asked him questions. This was the thing he could not account for. She did not ask him the questions people asked dukes, which were not questions at all but small ceremonies of flattery wearing question marks. She asked whether he thought the trout stream was overfished. She asked whether the almshouse roof would last another winter and what he intended to do about it if it would not. She asked what, in his considered opinion, was the point of keeping 40 rooms when a man could only be in one of them at a time. He answered. She disagreed with roughly half of what he said, and she disagreed not to provoke him and not to charm him, but because she had arrived at a different conclusion and saw no earthly reason to keep it to herself. He had not been genuinely disagreed with, without a single bow folded into it, since Cambridge. He found, to his considerable alarm, that it was the best part of his day. The comedy came without either of them arranging it, which the style of the thing required. In the second week, she remarked that his gardener had been cutting the hedges in a fashion she could only call aggressive. "He has been with the estate 30 years, said Ambrose. "I can tell. The hedges have the look of things that have been disciplined for decades and have given up the will to grow." He laughed. It came out before he could stop it. A short, rusty sound with the hinges stiff from disuse, and it startled both of them equally. Hector lifted his head. Prudence turned and looked at Ambrose, with the mild scientific interest of a naturalist who has been assured a certain animal is extinct and has just heard it in the shrubbery. "You should do that more often," she said. "I should not." "Why?" He did not answer. She did not press him, which he would come, over the following weeks, to understand was the rarest thing about her. She went back to her book. But he could feel, somewhere behind his ribs, the warm place the laugh had come from, and it had not been warm in a very long time, and that frightened him more than anything that had happened to him in 13 years. He arrived one morning to find her halfway up a ladder against the dower house, rehanging a shutter that had come off its top hinge in the wind. She had a screwdriver between her teeth and 3 screws in her palm and both hands occupied, and she was conducting the entire operation with the calm of a woman who had done it before and expected to do it again. Ambrose experienced, in quick succession, alarm, an urgent conviction that a lady ought not to be up a ladder, and the dawning understanding that there was nothing whatsoever he could do about it, because she was already up the ladder and had clearly been up a great many ladders, and did not require rescuing from this one. "You are on a ladder," he said. She took the screwdriver out of her mouth. "I am aware. I put myself here. Would you hold the foot of it, or would you prefer to stand there narrating my position, which I already know?" He held the foot of the ladder. He held it with the grim concentration of a man performing surgery. She fixed the shutter in under 2 minutes, came down, dusted her hands, and looked at the result with satisfaction. Ambrose looked at it too, and then looked at her, and thought, with a helplessness that was becoming familiar, that he had spent 30 years being the most capable person in every room he entered, and had walked, of his own free will, into the one garden in England where that was no longer true. In the 3rd week, she began bringing 2 cups of tea to the garden, one for herself, one set on the bench beside his usual place, without comment, without ceremony, as though it had always been there. The first cup she gave him had 3 sugars in it. He took 2. He drank it anyway, and said nothing. The next morning there were 2. She had corrected it without asking, and without mentioning it, the way a person corrects the hang of a picture in a room they mean to live in for a while. He did not mention it either. He thought about it for 2 days. It was over the tea, a few mornings after that he touched her for the first time, and neither of them had planned it, and both of them would remember it. She had set his cup on the armrest, and he had reached for it at the same moment she reached to move her book out of the way, and the backs of their hands met, and stayed met, for the length of time it takes a person to decide whether to move. He felt it go up his arm like the shock a man gets from a doorknob in dry weather, small and absurd and entirely out of proportion to its cause. He did not move his hand. She did not move hers. A blackbird sang somewhere with great confidence. Then she took up her book, and he took up his tea, and they went on as though nothing had happened, which was, Prudence reflected, the largest lie either of them had told the other so far, and she had told it with a straight face, and she was rather proud of that. The arguments about the trout were, for the record, the finest part of his week. She had formed the view that the estate's stretch of the stream was being fished past its patience, and she said so, and Ambrose, who had never in his life been contradicted on a matter of his own water, disagreed with the whole force of his rank and his education and a great deal of very sound reasoning, and lost. He lost, in his estimation, entirely on merit, and not at all because she was right, a distinction he maintained through 5 separate defeats and never once conceded. He would go home and lie awake constructing the argument he ought to have made, and arrive the next morning with it fully assembled, and she would demolish it inside 2 sentences while scratching the dog. And he would feel, obscurely, that this was the happiest he had been since boyhood, which alarmed him, because it had been achieved entirely at the cost of being wrong about fish. We will take a very short break. If you do not want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. In the 4th week, he brought her a rose. He did it the way he did everything that mattered to him, which was to say he made it look like nothing. He set a small terracotta pot on the bench beside her tea, a young rose in it, pale yellow, no taller than his hand, and he said, "For the wall, if you want it," and looked hard at the beech trees. She picked it up. She held it to the light the way a jeweler holds a stone he suspects of being finer than the setting deserves. Her hands, he had noticed, were not a lady's hands. They were strong and chapped, and marked with the small, honest scars of a person who did her own work. And they turned the little pot with a tenderness that had nothing performed in it. "This is a Rosa Banksiae," she said. "They do not, as a rule, survive this far north. Where did you get it?" "I grew it." She looked at him. She looked at the rose. She looked back at him, and something moved across her face that he could not read and did not try to. "You grew a rose that does not survive this far north?" "I wanted to see if it would." "Did it?" "It is in your hand," said Ambrose. She looked at the rose for a long time and said nothing else about it. That afternoon she planted it against the south wall of the dower house, in the one spot sheltered from the north wind by an old yew, and Ambrose watched from his study window at the top of the hill. He did not go down. He watched her tamp the soil with the heel of her hand and carry water in a little can and stand back with her arms folded and her head on one side. He watched her touch one small yellow bud with the tip of one finger, carefully, as though it were alive and might take fright. He turned from the window. He sat at his desk. He put his head in his hands. "No," he said to the empty study. "No. No!" Then it rained for 4 days, and the garden became a swamp, and neither of them went to it. He did all the things he had done for 6 years before she came. He read, he ate, he answered his letters. Not one of them worked. The house was the same house it had always been, but the silence in it had changed. It was not emptier, it was louder in its emptiness, as though it had formed an opinion about how he was spending his life and had decided to express it. On the 4th day, Hector stood at the front door and whined. "No," said Ambrose. Hector whined again. Ambrose opened the door. His dog trotted out into the rain, across the drowned garden, and vanished in the direction of the dower house. Ambrose stood in the doorway for 11 minutes in the wet, watching the path his own dog had taken and declining to follow it. Hector came back 2 hours later, soaked to the skin, smelling of lavender soap, with a folded note tucked under his collar. "Your dog arrived at my door in a state of considerable distress. I have fed him half a pie and washed him in my own soap. He is a traitor to your household. I return him under protest. P.H." The Rosa Banksii survived the rain. I thought you would wish to know. Ambrose read it. He put it in his desk drawer. He closed the drawer. He opened the drawer. He read it again. He closed the drawer again. He went to the garden the next morning at 10 minutes to 9. She was on the bench in a blue shawl, reading. She smelled faintly of lavender. Hector went straight to her. "He likes me better than you," she said. "I am sorry to be the one to tell you." "He likes your pie. That is not the same thing." "It is exactly the same thing. Love and pie are indistinguishable at the practical level. Both are warm, both sustain. Both are better shared than kept. This is my position, and I am not prepared to debate it before I have finished my tea." He sat down. He drank his tea, which had 2 sugars. She read. The sun came out for the first time in 4 days, and the garden steamed gently, and neither of them spoke for a long while. And the Duke of Wenfield, who had been fine for 13 years, was aware that he was no longer fine, and knew it, and did not get up. There was, in the 6th week, an afternoon of hard weeding, and at the end of it she was down in the flower bed on both knees with her hands full of bindweed, and he stood and offered her his hand to rise. It was a small thing. Men offered women their hands 100 times a day and thought nothing of it. He thought of nothing else for the rest of the day. She looked at his open hand for a moment, as though it were a proposal of some kind, which in a manner beneath the reach of either of their vocabularies it was. And then she put her chapped, earth-warm hand into it and let him draw her up. And she came up faster than either of them expected, so that for the length of one held breath they were standing closer than 2 people who address one another as Your Grace and Miss Halloway have any business standing. Close enough that he could see a fleck of soil on her cheekbone and the exact brown of her eyes, which he had never before been near enough to catalogue, and now found he could not stop cataloguing. Neither of them stepped back at once. And here, for once, it was not only his composure that failed. Her breath had gone shallow and quick, and she could feel her own pulse beating high and treacherous in her throat, and her hand, still folded into his, tightened once, of its own accord, before she made it let go. She was aware that he might have felt it. She hoped, with the fervor she usually reserved for the weather, that he had not. A person watching from the wall would have seen a duke and a tenant standing very still in a garden for no reason at all. Then Hector, who had no patience for whatever this was, pushed between their knees, and the moment broke, and she said, "Thank you," and he said, "Not at all," and they were both liars, and both of them knew it, and neither of them minded. In the 7th week, he told her. Not because she asked. She never asked. It was a quiet morning after rain, the garden very green, and she was sitting beside him reading with her feet drawn up under her skirt, and the shawl at her shoulders, and one curl had come loose and lay against the side of her neck, and he had been looking at the curl for some minutes, and she had not moved, and he understood, all at once, and with a curious calm, that he was about to say something he could not take back. "My parents' marriage was the worst in England," said Ambrose. She did not startle. She closed her book, slowly, keeping one finger in her place, and turned to face him. He told her the shape of it, not the whole of it. The 3 mistresses his father had kept without apology, his mother's 2 lovers, taken not from wanting, but from a rage she had never forgiven herself for. The 22 years in which 2 people who had once chosen each other had exchanged perhaps 11 civil words a year, and a night, when he was 16, when he had come down the servants' stair during a dinner party and found his mother on the floor of the kitchen passage in her best gown, weeping, in a place a duchess should never have needed to weep. He did not describe the passage. He said only that he had decided, that night, that whatever produced the weeping was a thing he carried in his own blood, and that the responsible course, the only decent course, was to keep it locked up where it could ruin no one but himself. She listened. She did not reach for his hand. She did not lean toward him. She did not make of his confession an emergency requiring her intervention. She listened with her whole self turned to him and her book still open across her lap with her finger marking the page, as though what he was telling her was important, deeply important, and also not more important than the ordinary green texture of the morning. And it was this, precisely this, the fact that she did not treat the worst thing he had ever said as a catastrophe, that undid him. When he finished, there was a long silence. A wood pigeon called from the beeches. Hector sighed in his sleep against her foot. "Ambrose," she said. It was the first time she had used his name. He noticed it the way one notices a step that is not where one expected the floor to be. "You have come to this garden every morning for 7 weeks," she said. "You have brought me tea and a rose and 3 separate arguments about trout in which you were wrong. You have laughed once. You have almost smiled a great many more times than that, and you believe I have not counted. But I have. Your dog has defected to my household and left a note. You tell me you are a man dangerous to women. I must tell you, as the woman who has been sitting beside you for 7 weeks, that you are the least dangerous man I have ever met. Your father was charming on purpose. You are charming by accident, which is an entirely different thing, and I suspect you know it. And I suspect that knowing it is what frightens you most." His jaw was tight. He was looking at the roses. "You may keep coming to the garden," she said gently. "I will not stop you. If you wish to stop yourself, you will have to manage it on your own. I am not going to do it for you." She opened her book. She went back to her page. He sat beside her and did not speak again for 20 minutes, and did not leave until noon. That evening, alone at a table laid for one, he understood that the silence in the great house had changed its nature entirely. It was no longer the silence of a man who prefers his own company. It was the silence of a man who knows exactly whose company he prefers and is not in it, and is beginning to grasp that this distinction is the only one that has ever mattered. So he did what any sensible man does when a thing has begun to matter too much. He began, quietly, to ration it. He noticed he had been arriving early, at 8:30, at 15:15, once at 8 o'clock, when he had told himself he was inspecting the hedges. He corrected himself to 9. He noticed he had been staying through lunch, eating the sandwiches she brought without asking, and without his ever remarking on them, the two of them chewing side by side in a silence so companionable it made his chest ache. He began leaving at 11. He noticed he had begun to plan what he would bring her: a jar of the estate honey, a second cutting, a book he thought she would enjoy quarreling with. He stopped himself. He arrived with empty hands. She noticed the hands. He knew she noticed because when he came she glanced at them. A quick, involuntary glance she covered at once by reaching for her tea. He caught it once. She caught him catching it. Neither of them said a word, and it was the first dishonest silence they had ever shared, and it sat down on the bench between them like a third person nobody had invited. There was one morning in that stretch, the worst of the mornings, when she leaned across him to reach the honey she had brought out to the bench, and her shoulder came against his arm and stayed there a moment, warm through 2 layers of cloth, and he felt his own hand rise of its own accord to the small of her back, the way a hand rises to steady a thing about to fall. And he stopped it. He stopped it in the air, an inch from her, and made it into a fist, and set the fist back down on his knee, and turned his face to the beech trees, so that she would not see whatever was written on it. She had felt the hand not arrive. He knew she had, because she went very still. And then she straightened and reached for her tea instead of the honey, and her hand was not quite steady, and she steadied it, and neither of them said one word about the hand that had come within an inch of her spine and gone back to being a fist. That, he thought, was the trouble with rationing a thing. The wanting did not shrink to fit the ration. It only grew louder in the gap. "You used to stay until noon," she said one morning, not looking up. "Now you leave at 11. Last week it was 10:30. At this rate you will be arriving and departing simultaneously by October, which will at least save time." "I have obligations at the house." She turned to Paige. "You have a steward who manages your obligations. You have told me so twice, once while eating my sandwiches." He left at 10:30. Hector did not follow him. Hector stayed on Prudence's feet and watched Ambrose go up the hill with an expression that could only be described as a verdict. Then he began to skip days. He told himself, the first Wednesday, that it was the rain, and it was not raining. He told himself, the Thursday, that he had correspondence, and the correspondence sat unopened while he stood at his study window and watched the clock pass 9 and 10 and 11, and felt the pull of the garden in his own body, an ache low in the chest and a restlessness in the legs, an awareness of a bench 200 yards down the hill and a woman on it and the exact shape of the empty place beside her where his tea would be going cold. He did not go. He stayed in his correct and orderly house and was more miserable than he had been in 13 years of misery he had at least understood. On the Friday he went at 10 instead of 9 and stayed 40 minutes, and she did not remark on the 3 days and did not rearrange a single thing, and was reading the same book she had been reading on the Tuesday, further along in it now, and it came to him with a small, cold shock that her life had gone on for 3 days without him in it, steadily, unhurt, and that this was the most frightening thing she had ever done. Because his mother would have paced and sent notes and asked the steward, and Prudence had simply read her book. We will take a very short break. If you do not want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. In the 11th week, his mother came from Bath. The Dowager Duchess of Wenfield arrived on a Friday and discovered within 2 hours from the steward, whose forthcomingness on the subject of her son's private life had by now achieved a nearly oracular quality and been lubricated by several additional cakes, that Ambrose had been visiting the tenant of the dower house every single morning for 11 weeks. She did not confront her son. She called on Prudence. She sat in the small parlor and accepted tea, and looked about her at the room. Books stacked in towers on every surface, a naturalist's library inherited from a dead uncle and clearly read to pieces. Wildflowers in a chipped jug on the sill, a jar of estate honey on the mantel, and through the window, climbing the south wall in flat defiance of its latitude, a pale yellow rose that had no business being alive this far north, and was thriving anyway. The Dowager had been reading rooms for 30 years. She read this one in under a minute. She told Prudence everything. The 3 mistresses, her own 2 lovers taken from Fury. The night her 16-year-old son had come down the servant stair and found her on the kitchen passage floor in her best gown, and how she had not known he was there until she looked up and saw his face, not crying, not shouting, only still, the way he had been still ever since. Prudence listened without moving, in the way Ambrose had learned she listened. When the Dowager had finished, she was quiet a long moment, and then she said, "Your Grace, I have a question, and I ask your pardon for it before I ask it." The Dowager nodded. "In the 22 years of your marriage," said Prudence, "was there ever a single morning when your husband sat with you, quietly, wanting nothing from you and needing nothing, simply choosing to be in the same room?" The Dowager's face changed. It did not crumble, it shifted, the way a hillside shifts when a cloud crosses the sun, the same features rearranged by a shadow that had not been there a moment before. "No," she said, "there was not. Your son has done that every morning for 11 weeks. The Dowager did not answer. She finished her tea. She set the cup down with enormous care, as though it might otherwise say something she was not ready to hear. "Miss Halloway," she said at last, "I do not know whether you will be good for him. I know he has never once been good for himself. That may be enough for the present." She went back to Bath on the Tuesday. She left a note on her son's desk. "The Dower House smells of lavender and books. Your dog was there. I did not ask how often you go. I did not need to." Ambrose put it in the drawer beside the note about the pie. 2 notes, both from women who had seen straight through him. He closed the drawer and did not open it again for a long time. But he took the closing of it as a kind of settling, the way a man tells himself a thing is decided, when in fact he has only stopped looking at it. The following week, Prudence's sister came from Yorkshire. Eliza was 30, married, cheerful, built along the general lines of a small, sturdy wardrobe, and in possession of a voice that carried across 2 fields and a hedge. She met the Duke in the garden on her 2nd morning, sat herself down beside him on the bench without invitation and without ceremony, and displaced Hector, who removed himself to Prudence's feet with the wounded dignity of a courtier passed over for promotion. Prudence was inside, making tea. Eliza did not wait for tea. "So," she said, "you are the Duke." "I am." "She writes of you in every letter, not by name. She calls you the neighbor. She has written of you 9 times since April. She has never written of anyone 9 times in her life. She once wrote of an exceptionally good pudding on 4 separate occasions, and I considered that excessive. You have outperformed the pudding. I have come to form my own view." "And what," said Ambrose with some care, "is your view?" Eliza looked at him the way a farmer looks at a horse she is considering buying, without sentiment, checking the teeth. "You'll do," she said. "You are too thin. She will see to that. My question is not whether you will suit. My question is whether you intend to propose before her lease runs out in October, or whether you intend to sit on this bench until she packs." Ambrose said nothing. "My sister has lived her whole life in other people's houses," said Eliza, and the cheerfulness went out of her voice, not sharply, only quietly, like a lamp turned low. "Our uncle's, my spare room, now your Dower House, on 6 months, and October coming on faster than either of you will admit. She has never had a thing that was hers. She has never been anyone's first choice. She was not our uncle's. He wanted a nephew and got 2 nieces, and never quite forgave the arrangement. She was not mine. I wanted her near me, and she wanted a life of her own. and I was not generous enough to be glad of it, which I regret. She is not yours. Your first choice is to be alone. She knows that. She stays anyway. And when October comes, she will leave, because the lease will end, and she does not ask to remain where she has not been asked to stay. She does not chase. She has never chased a living soul. She simply is, and she waits to see whether anyone will trouble to notice. She stood. You have noticed. You noticed 11 weeks ago. That was the easy part. The question is what you mean to do about it before October. The tea will be ready. I take mine with milk and no sugar. Prudence takes hers black. You take 2, and she puts them in for you, without asking and without counting. The way a woman does a thing she has done every morning for months. I watched her do it not an hour ago. And if you do not yet know what that means, then you are not the man my sister's letters describe. She went inside. Ambrose sat alone on the bench. The place beside him, where Prudence sat, was empty. Hector climbed up into it and laid his chin on the Duke's knee. Through the open window came the sound of the 2 sisters laughing in the kitchen, an easy, unguarded, unperformed sound, the laugh of a woman who has forgotten for a moment to be careful. He had never once heard Prudence laugh like that. She had laughed at things with him, at the hedges, at the dog, at his defeated arguments about trout. But she had never laughed like that in his hearing, freely, without watching herself, and he understood, sitting on the bench with his dog's chin on his knee, why. She had been watching herself with him for 11 weeks. She had been careful with him in a way she was not careful with her sister. From the very first morning, she had understood that he was a man who startled like a deer, and she had been, he saw it now, all at once, in a way that briefly took his breath. She had been gentle with him. She had been gentle with him for 11 weeks. She had measured out her own warmth to match what he could carry. She had met him at the exact height of the fence he could get over. She had brought 2 cups and counted his almost smiles, and planted his impossible rose against the south wall, and sent his dog home with a note about a pie, and not once, not one single time in 11 weeks, had she asked him for anything at all. He was sitting in a garden, being patiently and quietly loved by a woman who had never once asked him to notice. He had noticed. He did not propose. He had now a clock. The lease ended in October. He came to the garden. He stayed. He stopped rationing, because the rationing had failed the way a dam fails, all at once and then completely. And the vine was in the wall now, in the mortar, in the foundations. He thought of her when he woke. He thought of her when he ate. He thought of her in the middle of the night, in a dark house of 40 rooms, when the silence was not the comfortable silence of a solitary man, but the specific, particular silence of a man who knows that a certain person is asleep 200 yards away, and wants, with a sharpness that set his teeth on edge, only to be in the same room. He said none of it. He drank his tea and argued about the almshouse roof, and watched the beech leaves begin, at the edges, to turn. One morning she said, "Your lease is managed by your steward. I shall need to speak with him about October." "I will speak to him," said Ambrose. "Will you?" "Yes." He did not speak to the steward. He walked, instead, at 3 in the morning, through the 40 rooms of Wenfield Park in his shirt-sleeves in the dark, carrying a single candle, which was the only light in the whole vast house, and lit perhaps 4 feet of it at a time. He stood in every room his parents had occupied together, the drawing-room where his mother had sat alone every evening for a decade, in a chair placed so that she could see the door, waiting for a man who came home by another. The dining-room where his father had seated his first mistress at the family table, while his mother cut her meat into smaller and smaller pieces, and ate none of it. The morning-room, where they had exchanged their 11 civil words a year, each word a coin laid down with resentment. The long gallery, where the painted ancestors watched him pass, with the smug composure of people who no longer had to feel anything. The kitchen passage. He stood in each of them and held up his one candle, and listened to the silence, and tried to feel the difference between what his parents had had and what he had, and he could not find it. His hand, he noticed, was not steady on the candle. They had felt this too. His father had felt exactly this: the pull, the certainty, the conviction that here at last was the answer to a question he had not known he was asking. And his father had been wrong, and it had gone bad in the cask, and the house still held the lees of it, room upon room, the ghost of a love that had turned to vinegar and taken everything down with it. By 4 he was cold to the bone and no wiser, and the candle had burned to a stub, and he sat down on the bottom step of the great staircase in the dark, with the last of the light guttering in his fist, and Hector came and sat against his legs, and that was where the gray morning found the two of them, a duke and his dog, at the foot of the stairs, having solved nothing. In the morning he walked to the garden. It was early, 7:30, and she was not there. He sat on the bench. Hector sat beside him. The garden was cold. The September light was not the April light. It was thinner and lower, and had in it a quality of ending. She came at 9. She saw his face. She sat down and did not bring the tea, because she knew, from his face, that this was not a morning for it. "Prudence," he said, "I have to tell you something." She set her book aside and did not touch it again. "I am not going to propose to you," said Ambrose. A leaf came down off the beech. Hector's ears moved forward. "I have wanted to," he said. "Every morning this last month, I have sat on this bench and wanted to ask you. I have composed the question in my head 40 times. I have imagined your answer, and the morning after it, the two of us here with the thing settled and the fear gone. I have imagined it so often it feels like a memory, but I cannot trust it. I cannot trust the feeling to last the years. I watched my father love my mother with exactly this certainty, and I watched the certainty rot, and I watched the rot take the house and the children and 22 years of silence. And I would rather lose you now, whole and undamaged and free to go anywhere you choose, than keep you and watch myself become the thing that raised me. I am going to ask the steward to release you from the lease early, with full compensation. I will not trouble you again. I am sorry. I am more sorry than I have ever been about anything in my life." He was looking at the roses. His hands were on his knees and did not move. The garden was very quiet. Prudence did not speak for a long time. When she did, her voice was steady, and he did not yet understand what it was costing her to keep it so. "I am going to say 3 things," she said. "Then I am going to go inside. I will not argue with you, and I will not chase you. I told you in the 7th week that I would not, and I meant it." He nodded. "First, you have come to this garden for the best part of 5 months. In that time, you grew me a rose that does not survive this far north, and it is climbing my wall. You sent your dog to my door in the rain, and he came home smelling of my soap, and you said nothing of it for 3 days, and then you spoke of it as though it were the funniest thing that had ever befallen a man. And it was, and I watched your whole face change while you laughed. And I have not been the same since. You have eaten my sandwiches without being asked. You have argued with me about trout on 5 occasions and been wrong on all 5 and conceded nothing. You have sat beside me in silence on mornings when neither of us had a word to say, and the silence was better company than anyone I have ever spoken to. Your father did none of these things. Your father did not sit. You are not your father. You are the man who grew a rose for a woman he was afraid to love. That is not the same man, and you know it is not, and it is time you stopped pretending you do not." She paused. "Second, in the 7th week, you told me that wanting to be somewhere was the beginning of the thing you had spent your life avoiding. You were wrong. Wanting to be somewhere is not the beginning of ruin. It is the beginning of living. You have not been living for 13 years. You have been minding a house. I have watched you begin to live these last months. You laughed. You grew things. You sat still. You let a woman put sugar in your tea. These are not the deeds of a dangerous man. They are the deeds of a man who has been alone quite long enough. She paused again. And here her voice, which had been steady all these months, was steady no longer. Third, I love you. I have loved you since the morning you set that little pot on the bench and told me you had wanted to see whether the rose would live. I have been in love with you since then, and I have not said so because I decided the choice had to be yours, and I would not take it from you by handing you my feeling and making you carry the weight of it. The choice is yours. You have made it. I respect it. She stood. She picked up her book. She did not look at him. I will be gone by Friday. She walked to the dower house and opened the door and went inside, and the door closed. Ambrose sat on the bench. He sat there for a very long time. The morning passed. The sun crossed over the top of the sky and began the long slide down the far side of it. Hector, at his feet, shifted and sighed and did not leave. The shadows of the beeches moved across the garden wall like slow water. The red rosebush, the one she had scolded in April, the one she had told she expected more from, was in full riot now, tumbling over the stone as though it had spent 6 years waiting for one person to bother with it. On the south wall of the dower house, where he could see it if he turned his head, the pale yellow rose that should not have survived this far north was thick with flower. He thought about his father. He thought about the kitchen passage and the drawing room where his mother had sat alone for 10 years. And he thought, quite suddenly, of a thing he had never once considered in 13 years of considering nothing else. His father had never sat anywhere for anyone. His father, in 22 years, had never once sat on a bench for 4 hours because a woman had walked into a house. His father had always been able to stand up. That was the whole of it. Not that he had stopped loving, that he had always, at every table he ever sat at, been able to rise from it and walk away and look back at nothing, and it had cost him not one thing. Ambrose looked at his hands on his knees. He had not moved in 4 hours. I cannot walk away, he thought. It is costing me everything, and I am still here. I am not my father. I have never been my father. He stood. His legs were stiff and slow. Hector rose beside him, tail moving cautiously, as though the dog too could feel that the weather in the garden had turned. Ambrose crossed the grass. He reached the door of the dower house. He knocked. She opened it. Her eyes were red and her face was blotched, and she had been crying. Not the composed and decorative crying of a woman who has learned to cry becomingly, but the ugly, private crying of a woman who has spent her whole life believing she would never be anyone's first choice, and has just, in a garden, been proven right. In her hand she was holding a handkerchief. It was his handkerchief, taken from his coat pocket 3 weeks earlier when she had spilled her tea, and never returned, and never asked for, and it was, he understood now, the only thing of his she had ever kept. It is not Friday, said Ambrose. No, she said, I sat on the bench for 4 hours. I know, I was watching from the window. My father would not have sat on a bench for 4 hours. No, she said, he would not. I am not my father. No. He looked at her, at the red eyes and the blotched face, and the handkerchief, and the whole plain, unglamorous truth of her, standing in a doorway with a life packed into half-filled boxes behind her, and he found that everything he had been afraid to say had become, in the space of 4 hours on a bench, the easiest thing in the world. I have watched you since the spring, he said. You talk to plants and they obey you. You correct a duke's tea without asking and never mention it. You do your own work with your own hands, and you are not ashamed of the marks it leaves. You listened to the worst thing I have ever said and did not treat it as a fire to be put out. You have been gentle with me every single morning, and you have never once let me see it, because you did not want me to feel the weight of being loved before I was ready to lift it. I have seen it now. I would like, if you will let me, to spend a great many mornings learning to lift it." She had begun to cry again and to smile at the same time, which he had not known a face could do. "Prudence," he said, "I would like to marry you. I cannot promise you I will not be afraid. I will be afraid. I expect I shall be afraid for a long while, possibly forever, possibly on Tuesday mornings in particular. And I could not tell you why Tuesdays. I cannot promise the fear will leave. I can promise you the garden, every morning, tomorrow and the morning after and the morning after that. I can promise you tomorrow. I cannot promise further than tomorrow, but I should like to promise it every day, until the tomorrows have quietly become my life and no longer need promising at all." She pressed his handkerchief to her mouth. "That is enough," she said through it. "It is not enough. You deserve certainty. You deserve a man who is not afraid of Tuesdays." "Ambrose," she said, "come inside." He came inside. Hector came inside. The door closed. And out in the garden, on the bench with a splinter on its left side, 2 cups of tea sat cooling on the armrest, because she had carried out 2 cups that morning, as she had every morning, even the morning he had come to tell her he was leaving. Because she had always brought 2 cups. Because she had always, in some stubborn place beneath the steadiness, expected him to come back, even on the mornings he had not expected it of himself. They were married in September, in the long room at Wenfield Park, with the garden doors standing open and the September light coming in low and gold across the floor. The license was got quietly, the room was small, the words were few, and the whole affair was over in less time than it takes a kettle to boil, which was precisely as both of them wished it. His mother came from Bath and sat very straight in the front row, and did not weep at all until the moment the words were spoken, at which point she wept without stopping for the remainder of the morning, and did not wipe her eyes and did not apologize to anyone. Eliza came from Yorkshire, and wept before the words, during the words, and after the words, and embraced Ambrose with such force that he lost a button from his waistcoat, and said into his shoulder 3 times, "You'll do, you'll do, you'll do." The steward did not weep, but was observed by several guests to blow his nose on 11 separate occasions. 12 of the tenants came, having watched their duke walk down the hill to a garden every morning for 5 months, and were, to the last man, relieved. Hector attended. He sat throughout at Prudence's feet, and not at Ambrose's. Ambrose had, by then, made his peace with it. In the week before the wedding, Ambrose had the garden bench replaced. The old one was weathered gray and split, and bore on its left side the splinter she had warned him of on the first morning. The new one was oak, plain, made by the estate carpenter. Cut into the back of it, in plain, deep letters, was a single word. Not his name, not hers, not a date. Just the word. Yours. Because that was what she had said when he told her the choice was his. Because that was what the garden had always been. Hers, and his, and theirs, and no one else's in the world. She found it the morning after the wedding. She came out of the great house, the house now, not the dower house, at 5 minutes to 9, in her dressing gown, carrying 2 cups of tea. She walked to the bench. She saw the new oak, and the word cut into it, and she set the cups down on the armrest and ran the tips of her fingers slowly over the letters, and sat, and said nothing. He came out at 9 in his shirt sleeves with the dog at his heel. He crossed the garden and sat down beside her. She handed him his tea. 2 sugars. "You replaced the bench," she said. "The old one had a splinter. And the word? I could not think of a longer speech. It is the best speech you have ever given. It is the only one that ever mattered." They sat on the bench. The red roses she had scolded in April were blooming still. On the south wall of the dower house, the impossible rose, the one that should not have survived this far north, had climbed higher than either of them had expected, alive and stubborn and thriving in a place it had no business thriving. Hector lay across both their feet. The beech leaves were turning. 2 cups of tea cooled on the armrest, one black, one with 2 sugars in it, and neither of them spoke for a long time, because neither of them needed to, because the silence between them had never once been empty, and it was not empty now, and it would not be empty tomorrow. And the Duke of Wenfield, who had promised only tomorrow, every day, for the rest of his life, was, for the first time in 13 years, not afraid of the morning. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you are watching from and what the story made you feel. Do not forget to subscribe so you will not miss new stories.